Dr. Ginn,
Yes, sir.
the section you wanted us to read, section 4, did it start with main contentions, is what it said?
I've got it on the screen right here. Let me see. I've got my drawing tool. Hold just a second. Well,
That's fine. If we're going to discuss it later,
yeah, I actually have the whole section on the screen here. So
Okay.
for some reason, it's not letting me get out of the drawing tool here. That's crazy. I hate technology. I can't get out of the drawing tool. Okay, I'll be with you in a minute. I have figured this out, but I need to get everybody present, make sure you're getting credit for this. Okay. All right, here we go. Answer to your question.
Yeah, that's the right section. Thank you.
Yeah. Yep, that's it right here. And I've got it copied into a Word document, and it's what, 4 or 5 pages with a 20 font, so that everybody can see it. What we're gonna do basically is go over this. I highlighted an area for you on down here, as you can see. It's under volition. Now, that is that's actually a bad translation. You could say free will, but it's the Greek word here that you see right here, prohairesis. It's not the capacity for choice. It's not the actual free will itself, but it is the capacity for free will. Does that make a difference? Everybody understand that? It's not so much you're choosing, but the fact that you have a choice, that you can make a choice, and that you can live by that choice. That's what he means. That is the defining characteristic of human beings. That capacity, and it's that capacity that Epictetus finds to be the quintessential thing about human beings. It makes us different than every other critter. So we have that capacity, whether we do it or not, we have the capacity for making a decision and sticking by it, even if it's painful. And, we think in terms of things like chemotherapy. We make a decision to go ahead with chemotherapy to save our lives. And that's not an easy thing or a cutesy thing to do. It takes long-term hard commitment, and we stick by that. That's what he's talking about. So I hope you understand that he considers ethics to be that same kind of capacity in human beings. And if you read on down here, it is this prohairesis that is the real person, the true self. That's who you really are. When we get into Kant, we're going to find something similar in Kant, the idea that ethics begins with an individual that can make choices, stick by them, and take the hits. That's exactly what it is that makes a good person. Ethics, Kant says, is what every well-brought-up child should know. But the doing of that is different. And that's what Epictetus is talking about, and it's what Kant is talking about. Now, Epictetus has somewhat of a utilitarian or a consequentialist approach to ethics, like we find in Mill. But it's this qualitative notion, this act notion that Mill, pardon me, that Mill appropriates in his notion of the quality of the experience that leads to the best decision that leads to happiness, true happiness. It doesn't make you happy to go through chemotherapy. It makes you happy to take the chance of being cured. And if the cure comes, then that is true happiness. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
So that's what we shoot for. It's kind of, we might say, the long distance approach to things. And that's what he means by this word prohoresis. I think, we talk about humans have free will. That cheapens it to some degree to simply talk about free will. Now, there's a huge debate. Most often, when it comes to ethics and introductory philosophy, most professors, at least when I was a young philosopher, most professors had you read an essay exchange between Erasmus, the great Dutch humanitarian, and Martin Luther on free will. Luther maintained that human beings did not have free will, that their will was captive. It was captive to both selfishness and evil. And so it is exactly where we are corrupted, according to Luther. Erasmus, of course, is a humanitarian, and he makes, he wants to make sure that everybody understands that they have free will and should exercise that free will. That's a little bit different than the free will that Epictetus is talking about here. That is this capacity, not the doing of it necessarily, but the having of it, that makes human beings significant. We can choose not to exercise our free will, and it is of no use to us. But we can make radical decisions and stick to it. And that's where Epictetus is going with this whole idea of prohoresis. Now let's go back to the beginning of this essay on Epictetus here. The linchpin then of his entire thinking is that what it means to be a human being. And we've just learned what it means to be a human being is to possess prohoresis. That is the rational part of the human. Now, Plato had talked about, and Aristotle too, about the quality of soul. For Plato, there is psyche is tripartite. It's got three parts. It's got the appetitive, which is simply the desire for food, safety, all of the other basic desires that humans have. That's called the appetitive soul. We're driven to have those things. And then there's the political soul, which means that we live together in sort of the same space. And then there's the rational soul, which is that part of the soul in Plato that must have someone like Socrates as a doctor in order to sharpen that rational soul. That's the whole point of the little guy in the cave who looks at the world and looks at reality simply as shadows on the wall, and he doesn't know three-dimensional space at all, and he escapes one day and comes out of the cave into the sun and is blinded by the sun for a while. That's what happens to all of us, according to Plato, when we're born into this world. We're blinded. That soul is blunted, and it must have someone to explain to it this three-dimensional reality that we all live in. And that's where the Socrates, the great teacher, comes into effect. And everybody is in the state of blindness according to Plato. And the only way to get out of it is through study, education, sharpening of the rational mind. And that's where the great teachers come in. And that's the reason, you know, I think hopefully people remember their teachers fondly. Do you guys? I mean, you got great teachers in your past that did more for you than just teach you 2 + 2. That's what Socrates is asking and saying, that do we have those? And yes, we should have those, and we should cultivate those. And it's a lifelong process. We don't graduate. So if you look on down here, we have the faculty of assent. In other words, prohairesis is not just the capacity to do that, but it is the assent. It is the saying yes to that, it is the doing of that. And that assent, that saying yes, should be regulated by our awareness of logical consistency. You see here, so it's a logical thing. Let's go back to chemotherapy. The doctor explains to you that if you don't have this, you're going to die. And you decide that, yes, even though it's going to be painful for a short while, you will assent to the logical connection of this treatment to your healing. So it is the assent to that leads to the praxis in Latin of doing that. Now look here at 4.2. Kinship with God. Now we hear about this in Judaism and Christianity. You don't so much hear about it in Hinduism. The other great source of the depth of religion, where God is wholly other. God comes to us. You know, there are 33,000 gods in Hinduism, but those are simply illusion. Gods are, those 33,000 polytheistic gods are simply the illusion that we see in our state, in our human state. There's, in Hinduism, there's really truly only one. And that one is absolutely, in many ways, deeper than the one, the God of the West. But there's no sense in Hinduism of the kinship of that God. You know, the New Testament speaks. Paul talks about us being adopted as children of God. So this notion of kinship with God is a Greek. Well, it's not Greek, it's actually Hebrew. You know, in the Psalms describe King David as God's adopted son. So this sense of adoption or kinship with God is huge in Western society. And it's right here in Epictetus as well. He talks in his writings about Zeus, or the god, and he's still a Greek after all. He's still brought up in both pantheism and polytheism, where gods are everywhere. But for him, Zeus is simply the god. Zeus is where the buck stops. If you see here, there seems to be no question of competition with any other deities or powers. He doesn't deny that there are deities or powers. He simply says that they are subservient. Ultimately, Zeus wins. And look at this, immanent rather than transcendent. So Zeus inheres in and may indeed be identified with the natural order. That's called pantheism. We see that today in some, what we might call nature lovers. or nature itself becomes, is deified. So that has a philosophical and even religious source. Epictetus is that source. God is the creator of humankind as everything else. And he loves us. Now, when we read some of the myths, he truly does love us, doesn't he? But he simply is the source of this rationality. And then we come to section 4.3 of volition. So volition is a godlike capacity. This prohairesis is a godlike capacity. That's what's left over in us from this divine image. That's not so different than the Old Testament's notion in Genesis 2 of humans being created. By the way, in Genesis 2, it's not Adam that is created in God's image. It's Adam and Eve together that are created in God's image. So it's the male and the female, not just the masculine, but the imago Dei, which is the image of God, the Latin term for that. The imago Dei is man and woman together as the image of God. So don't let the sexist fool you here. So it's that volition we see here, that is the real person, the true self, the real individual. Now let's go on down to value. The language of the writer is a little strange. The distinction between what is internal to the sphere of prohairesis and what is external to it is the foundation of Epictetus' system of value. What is ultimately worth having, the good for people, consists in a certain disposition of the prohairesis. More explicitly, this disposition is the condition of virtue, which is the proper explanation or expression of our rational nature. This is a little bit different than Plato and Aristotle. Remember, we talked about this, and we'll end up the course by studying this in detail. But for Plato and Aristotle, the true rational person, the good human being, is one who practices justice, prudence, moderation, and courage. How do you know you're a good person? By the measure of how you are dedicated to justice, prudence, moderation, and courage. And I've said often, rather crudely comparing this to a racehorse. A racehorse is virtuous if it does what it is intended to do, and that is to win races. As a matter of fact, we could speak of a virtuous knife in Greek. A virtuous knife is, for Plato and Aristotle, is simply a knife that does what it's supposed to do. It's sharp, it cuts. So there's a very almost practical notion of value in Plato and Aristotle. And the good knife is the sharp knife. The good human being is the sharp human being that practices justice, prudence, moderation, and courage. But that's a little bit different in Epictetus. It's this proper assent that we talked about that is virtuous. So when the doctor tells you that you have cancer and that you need chemotherapy in order to continue your life, the virtuous decision, the assent, is to weigh the logical odds, the logical mathematical odds, and say, I will go through, I assent, I agree to go through with the treatment. That is virtue. Does that make sense, everybody? I hope that does. It's the saying yes to the logic is virtue for Epictetus. And that's a little bit different than Plato and Aristotle, but I consider it very illustrative of, the practice of the wise person. Further down here, we are not wrong to believe that whatever is good is advantageous to us and worthy of unconditional pursuit, for this is just the preconception, the prolepsis of good which all human beings possess. But we err in applying that preconception to particular cases, for we frequently assume that external objects have unconditional value. In reality, the various circumstances of our lives are merely what the volition, the prolepsis, has to work with and cannot in themselves be either good or bad. So it's the outcome, you understand, that having chemicals ported into your body is not good. That the individual actions sometimes are bad. We play the end game, according to Epictetus. It's how we use those things to the ends of becoming well or becoming wise. All of you know it's not easy to go to school right now, especially right now. This really tests the mettle of whether you really want an education or not. And how important is that too? If you're still sticking with this, you're a good Epictetian. You understand that circumstances are not necessarily good or bad. It's what you make of them that is significant. That's the most important thing I think we take from Epictetus, is that we are in control of our lives. We make decisions as logically and mathematically correct as we can, and then we live with the circumstances. The rest of this is simply more of what we've been talking about. But let's look at this. What does that mean? Well, if what Epictetus says is true, then we have to adjust our thinking to that. I don't know, to continue our notion of chemotherapy here. You know, I know that many of you have had grandfathers, grandmothers, parents, loved ones that have had cancer. And, you know, they perhaps have gone through chemotherapy, and it's cost them dearly in terms sometimes of their health, their short-term health. But we simply make the best logical decisions that we can make. That's what we do. That's what prolepsis is making decisions on the best math and logic possible, and then adjusting our emotion to that. What can we say about that? Well, if I have cancer and I decide to go through a course of chemotherapy, the doctor's probably going to explain to me the statistics involved. You have a 50%, 60%, 70%, 80% chance of recovery if you do this. If you don't do this, it's zero. We make the best decision that we can. Now, does that mean that things are guaranteed to turn out right for us? No, it doesn't. But Epictetus maintains, and this is for you to decide whether he's right about this or not, he maintains that to do the best that you can possibly do is all that you can do. So you must adjust your emotional response to the outcome in terms of the logical response to the possibilities. So the reevaluation of external objects brings with it a tremendous sense of confidence and inner peace. So you've done the best that you can. That should bring you inner peace. Grief, fear, envy, desire, and every form of anxiety result from the incorrect supposition that happiness is to be found outside oneself. He borrows, and I guess one might say really that he is a Stoic philosopher. So our writer here goes on to say, like earlier Stoics, Epictetus rejects the supposition that such emotions are imposed on us by circumstances or internal forces and are largely beyond our control. Our feelings, as well as our behavior, are an expression of what seems right to us, conditioned by our judgments of value. If we are correct, our judgments, our feelings will be correct as well. Now, this goes to all emotions, fear, anger, even happiness. We make the best decisions that we can, and we realize that ultimately we are not in control. The only thing that we can be in control of is our response to things. That is an essential Stoic position. I think of most Stoics would say that I was thinking the other day about our poor neighbors in Louisiana. My wife's family comes from Louisiana. And they're in tremendous straits now with this disease. But I was thinking about New Orleans, and I've talked about this before. New Orleans is, I don't know, what, 500 feet below sea level. That's not a very logical place to put a city. It's not wise to live in New Orleans. That is a decision that people made that was neither logical nor manageable ultimately. For the Indian tribes that passed through the area fishing each year in the summertime, that was fine to have a short encampment there below sea level. But when it came time to plant food, they went someplace else because the storms come and ravage, make that a swamp, reclaim it as a swamp again. So they were only nomadic. They only passed through there. It took Westerners to think that they could settle that place and make a city there. So that's another instance where human beings do not exercise logic or planning, and so bad things are necessarily going to accrue to those failures. So we have no right to feel sorry for ourselves, according to Epictetus, when we make decisions like that. We simply have made our bed and must lie in it if we continue to live there. That's not what Epictetus is talking about. Epictetus is talking about making logical decisions and then adjusting one's emotional life to them. Now, look here, Epictetus's conception of emotional adjustment is not that one should be unfeeling like a statue. Even the wisest person may tremble or grow pale at some sudden danger. more importantly for Epictetus, these are good things. These effective responses are good. It means to get out of there. And also, it's natural to be happy. It's natural to be elated by the good. Look here and think through this notion of elubia here. And then I'm going to let you read and think about 4.6 here. This is really an important section. 4.6, please pay attention to that. I'm going to let you go through that on your own time. I'm going to end by, because this is where we're going in Kant here. There's some method to this. I'm trying to help you understand how Mill must change, add to Bentham's notion of just adding up, whether we feel good about something or not. It's got to be deeper than that. Mill understood that. He's a philosopher. He's read Epictetus. He knows the truth of some of the truths of what Epictetus is talking about. So he adds quality to that. And I'm trying to help you understand by having you read Epictetus here simply what quality means. That's the whole purpose of Epictetus's writing, I think, is to talk about the quality of happiness. But in 4.7 here, he moves toward this little word autonomy. And that's where my great teacher, Robert Paul Wolff, wrote a book, oh gosh, back in the 70s, I guess, entitled In Defense of Anarchism. And he doesn't mean anarchism like throwing Molotov cocktails. He simply means exercising this autonomy. He argues in this book that, and he's a great Kant scholar, he argues in this book that in Kant, you can never square the autonomy that every individual has. And as I've told you, I think Kant agrees with Epictetus here in this notion of autonomy. So Kant's borrowing things from Epictetus as well, I think. But authority can never be balanced or can never be supplanted by this duty toward autonomy that every rational person has. And all people are rational. They just simply need to exercise that rationality in Kant. So autonomy is very important. You cannot do good things for others if you do not value your own radical autonomy, your own ability to choose for yourself and live through those decisions. So achieving the correct disposition of one's capacity for choice requires more than inclination. Look, it requires self-examination. It requires you to be radically honest about your views and whether they fit the world and truth or not. This kind of autonomy is sharpened by a life of the mind. That is what you have to do that, according to Epictetus and to Kant as well. You have to become that autonomous person before you can become that good person. You must become good for yourself before you can do good for others. So you must be at peace with yourself. A great German mystic was sort of kicked out of the church, but one of his great sayings was to reformulate, you love your neighbor as yourself, but first you must love yourself. I think that's a good notion of this autonomy in Kant, is you must be good for yourself and to yourself before you can become good to others. You must sharpen the ultimate tool in the drawer of your own goodness and goodness to yourself before you can become good for anyone else. If you don't, you're going to get caught up in this emotional response to things. And you're going to be useless to yourself. You're going to live your life in terms of anxiety. And that's going to proliferate into your life with others. So they're going to be, if you live a life of anxiousness inside, that's ultimately going to be what everyone sees about you. And you're going to be useless to everyone else if you're running around like Chicken Little all of the time. So you have to sharpen your insides before that can become important for other people as well. I hope that makes sense. We're going into Kant, so if you can begin reading employment in the textbook, the few pages into Kant for Tuesday. Let me talk a minute about where we're going from here. We're getting good attendance in these meetings, and I thank you for that. That means you're dedicated students. I hope that you've gotten the information from Dr. Quillen on how we can handle these courses. They're still thinking through some of those things, I think, in terms of grading, and if you need to take an incomplete, maybe extending the time frame for completing that incomplete. But the people that are attending these meetings and paying attention, if you can do that, you're not going to need an incomplete. You're going to get a grade, and you're going to get a good grade. I mean, most people, I'm very pleased at the way you're doing, and I commend you for that. It takes tremendous courage to get up and do that, and I appreciate that. I thank you for doing that, and it'll mean something to you, not necessarily that you've talked to me, but that you've done that will be significant. So I don't want anyone to be anxious about what kind of grade you're going to get, because we're going to work that out. And I promise that I will work with you on that. And I don't want you to be afraid or anxious about that. I'm going to work with you. So that's kind of the way we're going to go forward with this. We don't have a lot of answers to your questions right now, but there's goodwill. I can answer your questions with goodwill. Kant says that there's nothing good but a goodwill. Well, we'll talk about that on Tuesday or Thursday next week. But it's important to understand that what Kant means is what I mean right now, is that we're going to get through this. And even though the circumstances are not opportune, hopefully there will be a good outcome. Any questions anybody has?
No, sir.
No, sir.
Okay, well, we will meet again on Thursday. We're probably not going, I'm just going to do a check-in on Thursday. But if you could be here and let me find out how you're doing and assign you some more readings, we'll just do that for a short while on Thursday. Is that cool?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
Well, I will see you then, and everybody please stay safe and sound.
You as well.
You as well.
Good day to you all.
Bye-bye.